The village of Olanade was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's story, down to the name of the goat that once wandered into the chief's compound and caused an uproar. It was a village cradled by hills and kissed by early morning mists, where time seemed to move gently, in rhythm with the crops and the drums of the festivals. In Olanade, marriage was more than a union, it was a mirror of the village's honor. A public promise. A spectacle blessed by elders and sealed with community approval. In this world of tradition and watchful eyes lived Abony, a woman with silver-threaded hair, clear eyes that saw more than people said, and a voice like calm rain. She was known for her wisdom and the way her words seemed to settle quarrels with ease. Women came to her with their burdens, men greeted her with deep respect. Children followed her just to hear the old stories she told with a voice full of music and warning. Years ago, when Abony first married Kola, their union was the talk of the town. Kola was everything people admired in a man, tall, with smooth brown skin, a quick smile, and a voice that could charm even the grumpiest elder. He was a trader, always dressed neatly, his scent a mix of palm oil and foreign cologne. But beyond his charm was a man who knew how to play the crowd. He basked in praise, fed on admiration, and often stood at the center of attention even when it wasn't his to claim. Abony, unlike Kola, never sought the spotlight. Yet, somehow, their differences created balance, or at least that's what the villagers believed. Together, they hosted festivals, supported families in need, and offered counsel to young couples. People often said, if Abony and Kola can make it, anyone can. They were the golden couple of Olanade, the kind others held up as an example of what love should look like when it matured. But beneath the polished surface, the cracks were slow but steady. Kola began returning later from his trading trips. He grew more impatient with Abony's long pauses and careful words. The man who once adored her stories began to roll his eyes during conversations. He laughed louder around younger women. Abony noticed, of course. A wise woman always knows when the air has shifted. But she said nothing. Not yet. She carried herself with the same grace, smiling as the village watched, her heart keeping quiet storms no one could see. Everyone still believed they were perfect. And maybe they were, once. But perfection has a shelf life when one person starts to hunger for more than loyalty can offer. Abony stood in her compound many nights, watching the moonlight trace shadows across the ground, wondering if love ever truly lasts when admiration becomes addiction. She never spoke of her fears. In a village where silence is dignity, she chose to bleed quietly. It was in this village, with its rich soil and silent watchers, that the story began. Not with betrayal. Not with the funeral. But with a love that once stood tall, admired by all, now slowly withering under the weight of vanity and unspoken disappointment. Yijai came to Olanade like a wind that shifts the entire sky without warning. No one knew where she came from, only that she arrived one afternoon wrapped in color and mystery. Her skin glowed like rain-washed clay, her steps soft but sure, and her eyes, those eyes held something untamed. She rented a small hut near the river, said little to anyone, and yet, it didn't take long for every mouth in the village to carry her name like a flame. Kola noticed her first at the market. Abony saw it happen, though she never said a word. It was in the way his voice suddenly deepened when he asked for tomatoes, the way he smoothed his tunic and straightened his shoulders as Yijai walked by. To others it might have looked innocent. But Abony had lived beside him long enough to recognize the tilt of his interest. Her heart sank just a little, as if warning her of a tide that was about to pull too hard. The village buzzed within days. She's too quiet, too bold, too beautiful, the women whispered. Maybe she's a witch. Others admired her confidence, her independence. She worked as a seamstress, stitching garments so finely cut they seemed to dance in the breeze. The men noticed too, especially Kola. He began finding excuses to pass her home, offering help she didn't ask for, bringing her mangoes and fabric she couldn't afford. Soon those gestures grew into something more. Conversations held too long. Smiles shared too often. Abony's world cracked silently. She tried to carry on, tending the garden, greeting villagers, preparing Kola's meals without bitterness in her hands. But one morning she woke to find his clothes gone. Not all, just enough. Enough to say, "I'll be back when I please," or not at all. Later that day, someone saw him stepping into Yijai's compound with a basket of fruits and a woven mat. He didn't return that night. Or the one after. The village erupted with opinions, though most were whispered in corners or behind fanned hands. Some condemned him. How do you leave a woman like Abony? Others shrugged, offering the usual, men will be men. A few women looked at Yijai with narrowed eyes, while others envied the way she turned heads without effort. But no one said anything directly to Abony. They greeted her with forced smiles and gentle pity in their eyes. She received it all with the same calm grace, nodding, speaking softly, never asking for sympathy. Inside, however, her soul howled. This betrayal was not just about love lost, it was about years erased. The children they couldn't have. The land they tilled together. The sacred trust of partnership that once weathered storms and laughter and grief. She wondered, not for the first time, if love truly meant anything once beauty and youth entered the equation. Kola, meanwhile, strutted about like a boy reborn. He walked lighter, laughed louder, wearing his new affection like a prize. With Yijai on his arm, he became something else entirely, a man drunk on adoration. He stopped attending community meetings. He declined festivals where Abony would be present. He avoided eye contact with old friends who once admired his loyalty. Abony, however, did not disappear. She began walking taller, her silence sharpened into dignity. She did not speak ill of Kola nor Yijai. But her presence reminded everyone of what had been lost. And though some still looked the other way, a quiet unease settled over the village. A kind of shame that no one wanted to name. Yijai remained a mystery. She didn't apologize, didn't gloat. She simply existed, beside Kola, in the home that used to be a symbol of love. And in the space they now occupied, the air was heavy with things unsaid. But Abony knew something the others did not. Time remembers. And the heart, though bruised, can wait. She watched the days unfold like chapters. And though the world around her shifted, she remained rooted, weathered but not broken, waiting for the storm she knew would come. The days after Kola's departure bled slowly into weeks, and Abony bore her grief like a quiet stone lodged in her chest. The village whispered, of course. Some expected a storm from her, a public display of outrage, curses thrown into the wind, or maybe a confrontation in the market. But Abony did none of those things. She simply continued living, though every step now carried the weight of eyes that pitted her or watched to see if she'd shatter. She did not. Instead, Abony redirected her days into acts of care. She began visiting the sick more often, bringing herbs and teas brewed from the plants in her garden. She offered her hands to widows who had no sons, helping them fix leaking roofs or carry heavy baskets from the fields. In the evenings, she gathered young girls near her compound, teaching them how to read, how to sew, how to protect themselves not only with their hands but with wisdom. Her compound, once quiet and heavy with sorrow, began to hum softly with the rhythm of healing. But none of them knew the truth of her private ache. Each night, after the village settled into sleep and even the goats quieted, Abony lit a single clay lamp in her room and opened a worn leather journal. It was a gift from Kola many years ago, back when their laughter was genuine and their bed still warm. She hadn't written in it for a long time. Now it became her refuge. Page by page, she poured out the pain she wouldn't speak aloud. Every betrayal. Every silent night. Every time someone averted their eyes instead of asking how she was. She wrote to the version of herself that had believed in forever. Today he passed me in the market. He looked away. I stood straighter, as if I had no memory of how his hands once trembled holding mine. Do they know I still lay on his side of the bed because the emptiness feels honest? He looks younger now. But I wonder if he sleeps well. Writing became her secret strength. But it was not enough. One morning, when the ache became too much to contain, Abony walked deep into the forest, past the footpaths known to children and goats. She moved with the stillness of someone who belonged to the earth. The trees grew dense and the air thickened with silence. And then she arrived at the sacred grove, a hidden place where the villagers seldom went, a place whispered about with reverence. Here the old spirits were said to reside. The mothers of the mothers. The ancient ones who saw without judging. Abony knelt beside the largest tree, its roots coiling like sleeping serpents. She laid her palms on the earth and began to weep, not the loud, broken sobs of despair, but the slow, painful release of someone who had held on too long. Her tears soaked the soil, and the wind responded with a soft rustle, as if acknowledging her grief. I do not want vengeance, she whispered. I do not wish him harm. But I want to remember who I was before love made me small. She returned there often. Each visit, she brought something, a handful of rice, a blossom, a strand of her own gray hair. Offerings not to beg for anything but to honor her endurance. She began to feel lighter. Not healed, not yet, but sturdier. Rooted. The village noticed. They couldn't say exactly what had changed, but there was something in the way Abony now moved. Something regal, almost. Her eyes were clear, her shoulders square. Even Yijai, the younger woman, seemed to shrink a little when they crossed paths, perhaps confused by Abony's peace or haunted by it. Kola? He never spoke of her. But those who knew him well noticed the restlessness creeping into his laughter. The way he sometimes stared into the fire longer than necessary. How he drank more palm wine than he used to. He did not look younger anymore. He looked unsettled. Abony remained silent even when her name returned to the lips of the villagers, not as gossip but as respect. And so she continued, tending, teaching, writing, walking. She endured not with fury but with quiet grace. And in that grace something powerful began to stir. Kola's new life, which began with pride and bright smiles, gradually turned into a slow unraveling. At first, everything seemed to confirm his decision. Yijai was radiant, youthful, and spoke to him in soft, teasing tones. She dressed in silk and danced in the evenings, bringing a kind of energy to the compound that Kola mistook for vitality. Villagers who once stared disapprovingly now offered half-smiles and respectful nods. Kola felt vindicated. He strutted through the village like a man reborn. But beneath the surface the foundation was beginning to rot. It started with the land. His crops, once bountiful and healthy, began to wilt before harvest. First the cassava, then the yams. Even the goats seemed restless, their eyes wide and strange at dusk. He blamed the rains, then the soil, then the workers. But other farmers' plots flourished. Only Kola's land seemed to sour beneath the sun. Then came the illness. Kola, once strong and proud, began waking with sweats that drenched the bedding. His body grew weaker, joints aching like an old man's. The village healer came, burned herbs, and left confused. "There's nothing in your body," he said. "This is not of the flesh." Yijai, who once spent her evenings singing by the fire, stopped smiling altogether. She grew quiet, watchful. Sometimes Kola would wake at night to find her standing by the window, whispering, not to him but to the shadows that hung on the walls. He would call her name, but she would not respond. Only when he rose and touched her did she blink and turn slowly, as if returning from somewhere very far away. "Who were you speaking to?" he asked once. "No one," she answered, but her eyes told a different story. His dreams became a torment. Each night, Kola was pulled into a world where the trees bled and the ground whispered. In those dreams he often saw Abony, not angry or vengeful but silent. Watching. Always watching. Her face calm, her hands folded. And yet, it was this stillness that unnerved him. He would wake gasping, heart racing, convinced she had done something to him. Convinced that perhaps she had summoned spirits against him. But when he passed Abony in the market, she said nothing. She carried a basket of herbs and greeted others with a gentle nod. She walked with the poise of someone at peace. It infuriated him. It terrified him. He began avoiding the parts of the village where he might see her. One night, while walking home late from a drinking session at the palm wine stall, Kola tripped on nothing and fell hard. As he lay dazed on the ground, he thought he saw Abony standing at the corner, her figure outlined in the moonlight. But when he blinked, she was gone. He scrambled to his feet and ran, like a child afraid of ghosts. The villagers noticed. People whispered not just about Kola's misfortunes, but about the unnatural silence in his compound. About how Yijai's laughter had turned to murmurs. About the rotting crops and the strange animals that now skittered through his yard at night. Some began to avoid his home altogether. Superstition was thick in the air, and while no one spoke of curses outright, many began lighting extra candles at night and muttering prayers when they passed his gate. And still Abony said nothing. She did not gloat. She did not warn or curse. When a child asked if she had bewitched her former husband, she smiled softly and replied, "No. Some storms arrive without thunder. They simply settle in." Kola grew desperate. He visited the grove once, looking for the spirits himself, but the trees were silent. He offered yams, kola nuts, even goat blood, but there was no answer. Not the one he sought. The wind did not move, the earth did not shift, and the silence mocked him. At home Yijai now barely spoke at all. She had taken to lighting candles in every room, drawing symbols on the floor with chalk. Kola once asked her what she was doing. She answered only, protection. From what, she wouldn't say. Kola began to dread sleep, for his dreams were now more vivid than his waking life. Abony's face loomed larger, her silence heavier. Sometimes he awoke screaming, only to find Yijai standing over him, her expression unreadable. Misfortune wrapped itself around Kola like a second skin. And the village, once divided, now watched him with suspicion and fear. They didn't say it aloud, but many thought the same thing. Perhaps he had tampered with something sacred when he betrayed a woman whose spirit had always walked with the ancestors. And perhaps now he was simply learning what it meant to live without her blessings. The night Kola died, the sky had opened with fury. Thunder cracked like the earth itself was splitting. The rain didn't fall, it lashed, slashed, pounded as if to peel the very skin of the village. Palm trees bent low in the wind, and the thatched roofs groaned under the storm's weight. It was the kind of night where the old ones whispered prayers and the children huddled under blankets, forbidden to look out the windows. Storms like these were seen as omens, especially in a village so tethered to the old ways. Kola was alone when it happened. Yijai had left hours earlier, without warning, without a word. Some claimed she had been seen walking barefoot into the forest just before the sky broke. Others said she never existed at all, that she had been a spirit who came to collect what Kola owed the universe. No one knew for certain. What they did know was that Kola's house, once filled with pride and music, was silent that night, save for the wind screeching through the broken shutters. When the storm passed at dawn, the village was soaked in stillness. Trees had fallen. Chickens and goats wandered dazed. The people emerged from their homes blinking against the pale gray morning, assessing the damage, breathing sighs of relief. All except one house. It was the old vendor who first noticed. Kola's gate, which usually groaned when opened, hung ajar. His front door, always tightly shut since Yijai's arrival, stood open like a gaping mouth. The vendor, cautious but curious, stepped through. What he saw sent him fleeing down the path, shouting for the elders. Kola was curled on the floor of his bedroom, twisted as if he tried to crawl away from something. His mouth hung open in a silent scream, his eyes wide, bloodshot, unblinking. No marks marred his skin. No bruises, no blood. Just terror, raw and frozen in his expression. Whatever had come for him in the night had left no trace. Except for the fear. The elders came. The healer came. Even the priest from the mission came. They examined him, whispered over him, crossed themselves, lit incense. The healer shook his head. The priest muttered about spirits. But none could explain what had claimed him. It was not sickness, one of them said. This was something else. The village gathered for the burial. They mourned as tradition demanded. Drummers played the slow, haunting beat reserved for sudden deaths. Women wailed, though the sound was more dutiful than sorrowful. Men carried his body wrapped in white, his eyes finally closed by trembling fingers. But the whispers would not stop. He died of fear, someone said quietly. Or guilt, another added. He saw something, an old widow murmured, clutching her walking stick. Something from the other side. And then there was Abony. She arrived late, walking slowly from the far end of the village path, her head covered, her body draped in white. White, the color of mourning, yes, but also the color of the ancestors. Of spirits. Of power. She did not cry. She did not speak. She stood at the edge of the burial crowd, eyes fixed on the grave as though watching not her former husband, but the last chapter of a story only she had read. People moved aside when she passed. Not out of fear, out of reverence. For in the months since Kola had left her, Abony had become something more than a scorned wife. She had become a presence. One that moved through the village not with bitterness, but with the weight of dignity and mystery. As the first shovelful of earth fell on the coffin, the wind picked up again. Just a gust, just a breath, but enough to send the nearby palm fronds rattling like bones. A child began to cry. A woman fainted. The elders called for calm. Still, Abony said nothing. When it was over, she walked to the edge of the grave. She stood there for a long moment, her eyes steady and unreadable. Then she whispered something, so low that not even the drummers heard it. She turned and without a backward glance walked away from the grave. The wind followed her. That night the village did not sleep easily. The whispers only grew louder after the burial. Some said the ancestors had intervened. Others believed Kola had been claimed by the very spirits he had mocked when he betrayed the vows he'd made under their gaze. Still others said it was simply justice, not the kind given by human hands, but by something older, deeper, and far more patient. And Abony? She went home, lit a small oil lamp, and sat by the window with her journal in her lap. She did not smile. She did not weep. Outside, the rain began again, soft this time like a cleansing. The sun rose reluctantly on the morning after Kola's death, filtering through a thick mist that clung to the trees like a warning. A hush had settled over the village, not the kind that follows mourning, but the kind that precedes something unspoken. Word had spread fast. Kola was dead. And not just dead but unnaturally so. Found curled like a frightened child, eyes wide as though they'd glimpsed something from the spirit world. A man of pride brought low in silence. As tradition dictated, preparations for his funeral began the very next morning. The elders, draped in ceremonial wrappers and red beads, gathered under the ancient Irako tree. Palm wine flowed with restraint, and the town crier's bell clanged with a gravity not felt in years. The rites were clear. A widow must perform certain rituals, a series of symbolic acts showing grief, closure, and humility before the ancestors. She would sleep on a mat near his body, shave her head, wear mourning white for weeks, and publicly declare his virtues no matter their truth. This was the way. This was how a soul crossed in peace. But when they sent word to Abony, she did not come. The emissary, a soft-spoken old woman named Mama Tay, knocked gently on her door, her wrapper still damp from dew. Abony opened it, regal and composed in her white shawl, the same one she had worn to the burial. "They say you must come," Mama Tay said softly. "To mourn him properly. To fulfill your duty." Abony's eyes didn't flinch. She stood tall, back straight, jaw firm, yet her voice was calm. "I already buried him long ago." Mama Tay blinked, unsure she'd heard right. "But, child, it is not just for him. It is for the land. For peace. For the eyes watching from the trees. I mourned him the day he left me for a girl who played with charms and shadows," Abony said. "I shaved my soul, not my head. The rest is for the living to pretend." And with that she closed the door. The response sent a ripple through the village. Some were outraged. Some intrigued. Some, if they were honest, felt an unfamiliar shiver of awe. Because Abony's words carried weight, not the wild defiance of youth, but the measured truth of a woman who had held grief long enough to shape it into something sacred. "She defies the rites," an elder barked. "That is dishonor." "Or wisdom," another countered. "Who can say she is wrong? Didn't she wear widowhood while he still walked the earth?" Around the cooking fires and water wells, the talk continued. "She is proud," someone whispered. "Too proud." "She is free," another said. "Too free." But the strangest opinions came from those who had once mocked her behind her back, women who had laughed at her silence, and men who had once admired Cola's swagger. "She carries a kind of power now," one woman said, glancing over her shoulder. "Something I cannot name." The elders tried again. This time it was Chief Obanla himself who approached her, leaning heavily on his staff. "You will bring unrest," he warned. "When rites are broken, spirits linger." "His spirit has long wandered," Abony replied. "And if it has not yet found peace, that is between him and the truth he ran from." "What of the girl?" he asked. "The one he left you for?" "Gone," Abony said. "Like a shadow at sunrise." With no agreement from her, the funeral preparations continued without her participation. Women peeled yams in silence. Men gathered firewood. Drummers rehearsed their slow beats. Palm fronds were cut and strung, and cola nuts offered at the foot of Cola's compound. But everything felt incomplete, like a page torn from the middle of a sacred book. Children were hushed. Chickens pecked nervously. Even the wind moved differently. And Abony remained in her small home, pouring palm oil into a lantern, rereading the pages of her journal where grief had turned to poetry, pain to parable. She lit incense not for Cola but for peace, for the kind of peace she had carved out of silence and sacrifice. When a few bold villagers asked her if she feared a curse, she answered simply, "I fear nothing that respects truth." By the time the funeral procession began, it was clear the village had shifted. Some still murmured about tradition and duty. But others, especially the women who had once scoffed, watched Abony with new eyes. Because sometimes defiance is not rebellion. Sometimes it is clarity. And sometimes, a woman declining to weep becomes the loudest cry of all. The morning of Cola's funeral dawned cold and still, as though the earth itself was holding its breath in anticipation. A heavy fog rolled through the village, hiding the sun and casting a shadow of unease. The entire community had gathered for the burial, their steps slow and deliberate as they filed into the village square. The women wore their mourning whites, their faces somber and eyes downcast, while the men, once Cola's friends and allies, stood in uneasy silence. Even the children, usually full of laughter and mischief, sensed the gravity of the day and whispered among themselves. The procession began with the elders leading the way, their ceremonial robes flowing behind them like ripples in water. Cola's body, carefully prepared and laid to rest in an ornate wooden coffin, was carried by his closest companions, their faces betraying little emotion. There were no celebratory songs, no drums, no laughter. This was no celebration of life, it was a reluctant passage, a departure forced by too many secrets and unspoken truths. Abony, as expected, was nowhere to be seen, except for her presence in the distant crowd, standing apart from the funeral rites, her hands folded calmly before her, her gaze unwavering. Some might have seen it as a lack of grief, others as a sign of finality, her acceptance that Kola was a man forever lost, not just in body but in spirit. The village square was filled with a stillness that seemed to hold its breath as the coffin was lowered into the earth. For a moment, the only sound was the creaking of the wood as it hit the dirt and the rustling of palm fronds in the wind. The elders whispered prayers and the mourners muttered blessings. Yet, despite the solemnity, there was an undercurrent of unease, an unspoken tension in the air. It felt as though the land itself was waiting for something beyond the rituals, something that had yet to unfold. And then, as the last handfuls of dirt were tossed onto the coffin, something extraordinary happened. A dark shape passed over the crowd. At first it was small, almost indistinguishable from the clouds, but soon it became clear. A flock of black birds, their feathers gleaming like shadows against the gray sky, circled overhead. The villagers looked up, startled, unsure whether this was a sign from the heavens or just an ordinary flock passing by. But the birds didn't fly away. They hovered, twisting and turning in a tight, swirling formation, as if something had held them in place. The air grew heavy. The mourners held their breath, watching the birds until the silence was broken by a sharp, unnatural wail, a sound so raw, so filled with anguish that it sent chills through every listener. It was not the weeping of a widow, nor the cry of a grieving lover. It was something far deeper, something unsettling and alien. All eyes turned toward the source of the wail. It came from Yijai. Her body was trembling, her hands gripping her chest as though in pain. She had been standing quietly beside the other mourners, her face pale and drawn, but now she was overcome by an energy that seemed to radiate from her like a dark force. Her eyes were wide, her lips trembling as she gasped for air, each breath coming in sharp, erratic bursts. And then, with a final, anguished cry, she collapsed to the ground, writhing in what seemed like agony. The villagers rushed forward, confusion and fear flashing across their faces. Some tried to approach her, others hesitated, unsure of what to do. But before they could reach her, she pushed herself up onto her knees, her head thrown back as her voice rose in an eerie, inhuman wail that echoed through the village. "I was never human," Yijai cried, her voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I was sent to test you, Abony. To test your strength, your heart, your resolve." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The words were not just a confession, they were a declaration, a truth that seemed impossible yet undeniable. The women who had once whispered about Yijai, the young, mysterious woman who had come into their village like a breeze, now stood frozen in disbelief. The men who had eyed her with lust, now stared with wide, frightened eyes. Kola's death, which had seemed like a simple consequence of his reckless choices, suddenly felt like the conclusion of something much deeper, more profound. Yijai continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "I am not of this world," she said, her face contorted in pain. "I am a spirit sent to test Kola's heart, to see if he would recognize the love that was already there, if he would choose loyalty over vanity. But he failed. He chose the fleeting allure of youth, the charm of a new life over the steady strength of what was always there." Abony's face remained unreadable, her eyes calm yet piercing as she listened to Yijai's words. There was no surprise, no fear in her gaze, only a quiet understanding, as though she had known all along that something greater was at work. "Why now?" Abony asked, her voice steady, almost too calm. "Why reveal yourself now when it is too late?" Yijai's body shuddered, and for a moment, the air seemed to thicken with a strange, otherworldly energy. "Because Kola's soul cannot rest," she said, her voice growing softer, more distant. "He is lost, Abony. And so I reveal the truth so that you can have peace, so that his mistakes do not follow you into the next world." The wind howled, and the flock of birds above seemed to shift, the black shapes blotting out the sky for a moment before dispersing, as though their task was done. Yijai's body sagged and she collapsed to the earth, the energy draining from her as quickly as it had come. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Some were too frightened to speak, others too confused to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. The villagers who had once whispered about the mysterious Yijai now found themselves questioning everything they had ever known about the world around them. Was she truly a spirit sent from the beyond? Or had this been some kind of elaborate trick, some strange, twisted game? But Abony, the woman who had endured so much and yet remained unbroken, stepped forward. Her steps were slow, deliberate as she approached Yijai's fallen form. She knelt beside her, her face soft with a compassion that no one had expected. She placed a hand gently on Yijai's forehead, her touch almost tender. "Rest now," Abony said quietly. "Your journey is over." And with those words, the tension that had gripped the village seemed to lift. The birds were gone and the sky began to clear. The mourners, who had been paralyzed by fear and disbelief, slowly began to move again, their eyes shifting between Abony and the woman who had been revealed as a spirit. Kola's body was finally lowered into the earth, but this time there were no tears, no angry cries. There was only a deep, profound silence. A silence that spoke of endings and beginnings, of tests and trials, of strength and weakness. As the villagers turned to leave, their footsteps heavy with the weight of the day's revelations, Abony remained at the gravesite for a moment longer. She looked down at the freshly turned earth, her heart heavy but not broken. For she knew that the truth had been revealed, that the spirit who had come to test her had finally departed, leaving her with a new sense of peace. In that moment, Abony understood something that no one else did, that sometimes, the greatest strength lies not in holding on but in letting go. And sometimes, the most profound lessons come from the most unexpected places. Abony stood in the stillness of the moment, her face a mask of serene composure as the villagers slowly processed the revelation that had just shaken their world. The whispers still echoed in the air, and many eyes were turned toward Yijai, who lay motionless on the ground, her spirit seemingly having left her body. The tension was palpable, the weight of the truth settling like a heavy cloud over the crowd. But Abony remained still, her posture unwavering. There was no sign of fear or confusion in her eyes, only a quiet understanding. She had been watching this all unfold with a calm that seemed unnatural to the others, as if she had already known what was coming. And now, as the village stood on the precipice of a new reality, it was her turn to speak. Without a word, Abony took a single step forward, her sandals making no sound on the earth beneath her. The mourners watched in silence as she approached the grave of her former husband, Kola. The air was thick with tension, but Abony's movements were deliberate, graceful, as though she were performing a sacred ritual, one that was far older than any of them could comprehend. Her eyes, dark and steady, gazed down at the freshly turned soil where Kola's body now lay. She knelt beside the grave, her hands pressing gently against the earth, as if she could feel the weight of the man who had once been her husband. There was no anger in her heart, no bitterness. There was only the quiet presence of a woman who had lived a lifetime of trials and had finally reached a place of clarity. "I always knew," Abony said softly, her voice carrying across the still air. The words were simple but they held the weight of a lifetime. "I always knew who Yijai was." A ripple of surprise spread through the crowd. They had thought her silent suffering had been out of ignorance, that Abony had been unaware of her husband's betrayal, of the mysterious woman who had entered their lives like a tempest. But now, Abony's words rang with the certainty of someone who had seen beyond the veil of the ordinary, who had understood more than she had ever let on. "Yijai was never a woman," Abony continued, her gaze never leaving the grave. "She was a spirit sent to test us, to test me. But not for revenge as you might think." Her voice was steady, calm, as she spoke of the supernatural forces at play. "I made a silent pact with the ancestors long ago. Not for vengeance, but for clarity and justice. I asked them to show me the truth, to give me strength in the face of betrayal, and to guide me through the trials that lay ahead." Her words, though soft, struck with the force of thunder. The villagers, who had once pitted Abony for the humiliation she had endured, now saw her in a different light. She had not been the passive, long-suffering wife. No, she had been aware all along, playing her part in a much larger, unseen story. She turned to face the crowd now, her eyes sweeping over the people who had watched her for so long, some with sympathy, others with judgment. "I did not need to confront him," she said, her voice clear. "Kola's heart was already lost. He chose vanity over love, youth over loyalty. He chose to break his vows and for that he paid the price. But I did not need to punish him. The ancestors saw to that." Abony stood now, her posture as upright and proud as it had ever been. The whispers in the crowd were growing louder, but she did not flinch. She had made her peace long ago and now the truth was out. The villagers could think what they wanted, but Abony knew the depth of the journey she had traveled. She turned back to Kola's grave and placed her hands together in a quiet prayer. "May his soul find peace," she whispered, the words soft but filled with an emotion that no one could mistake. There was no anger in her words, no desire for retribution. There was only a deep, abiding sense of closure. May he learn from his mistakes in the next life. And with that she rose. There was no dramatic gesture, no tearful cry of grief. Abony's sorrow had already been lived, already been processed in the sacred grove, already laid to rest within her heart. The closure was in her acceptance, in her quiet strength. She had been tested, just as Yijai had been sent to test her, and now she had passed the trial. As Abony began to walk away from the grave, the crowd parted for her, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and confusion. They had never seen a woman carry herself with such grace in the face of betrayal, in the face of such public humiliation. But they were beginning to understand now. Abony was not a victim. She was a survivor, a woman who had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, wiser, and unbroken. The sky had cleared as she spoke, the sun breaking through the clouds and casting a warm, golden light over the village. The birds, who had once circled overhead in ominous formation, were gone, and a peaceful stillness hung in the air. The moment was one of quiet resolution, a turning point in the story of Abony's life, a moment that the villagers would never forget. As she walked away from the grave, her footsteps sure and steady, Abony's heart was light. She had done what she had come to do. She had faced the truth, embraced the strength of her ancestors, and now she could move forward, free from the shadows of the past. The village would remember this day, but it would also remember Abony's courage. And in time they would learn that sometimes the greatest power lies not in vengeance, but in the ability to let go and walk away with dignity. You said. The events surrounding Kola's funeral and the subsequent revelations had a profound effect on the village. What had begun as a tragedy of betrayal and heartache transformed into a pivotal moment that forever altered the hearts and minds of the people. In the days following Kola's death and Abony's unveiling of the truth, the village was quiet, almost reverent. The echoes of the mysterious woman's confession still lingered in the air, and the villagers could not stop speaking of the events that had unfolded. They had all watched the rise and fall of Kola, his vanity, his infatuation with youth, and his untimely death, and they couldn't help but reflect on the lessons that were now laid bare before them. The idea of beauty, youth, and superficial appearances had always held sway over many of the villagers. They admired the physical, the vibrant, the newlywed. It was no secret that Kola's new marriage to Yijai, a woman young enough to be his daughter, had been an object of envy and fascination. She was beautiful, alluring, mysterious, and it had been easy for the villagers to overlook her peculiarities because of her youthful glow. But now they could no longer ignore what Abony had shown them. True beauty was not found in the surface, but in the depth of character and the wisdom accumulated over a lifetime. As the weeks passed, the village began to change. Slowly, the focus shifted from the physical to the spiritual. People began to visit the sacred grove more often, not only to seek solace but to meditate and reflect on the deeper meaning of life. The younger women no longer admired the fleeting beauty of youth as much as they once did, instead seeking to cultivate inner strength, wisdom, and kindness. Abony's quiet strength had been a living example of resilience, and now, the villagers began to embrace her wisdom. Women came to her not just to seek advice on how to be good wives, but to ask about how to build strong, independent lives for themselves. Men too, who had once turned to Kola for counsel, now sought out Abony for guidance. They had come to understand that strength was not merely about physical power or youthful vigor, but about the fortitude of spirit, the ability to endure, and the wisdom gained through hardship. Abony, ever humble, accepted her newfound role in the community with grace. She did not seek recognition or accolades, but it was impossible for the village to ignore her influence. She was no longer just the quiet wife of the once popular Kola. She had become a beacon of wisdom, a woman who had endured suffering and emerged stronger. The respect the villagers now had for her was not based on pity, but on admiration. They recognized that she had been tested in ways they could scarcely imagine, and she had passed every trial with dignity. As time passed, Abony became a revered elder in the village. People would seek her out for guidance on matters both personal and communal. Her advice was sought not just by young women but by mothers, fathers, and even the village leaders. She was asked to speak at gatherings, and though she always remained humble, the villagers could feel the power in her words. They had seen her transformation and in turn, it inspired their own. The elders too took notice. They began to see how much the village had changed, how much the hearts of the people had shifted. And so, as a mark of respect, they decided to honor Abony in a way that no one had expected. They built a shrine near the sacred grove where she had gone to seek strength during the most painful times of her life. The shrine was not just a tribute to Abony, but to the strength she had represented, strength born not from beauty, but from wisdom, perseverance, and the ability to rise above hardship. The shrine was simple but powerful. Made of local stone and wood, it had a serene, peaceful quality to it, standing as a reminder to all who visited that true beauty was found in the strength of spirit. The villagers would often stop by, especially during times of personal strife, to reflect and remember the lessons they had learned through Abony's journey. Some would leave flowers, others would light candles, and some would simply sit in silence, contemplating their own lives and the wisdom they could gain by following in Abony's footsteps. At the same time, the village itself underwent a subtle yet profound transformation. The people began to focus more on cultivating their inner selves. Material wealth became less important, and instead the community bonded over shared values of integrity, kindness, and respect for the wisdom of their elders. Abony had shown them the true meaning of strength, and that strength did not come from outward appearances or fleeting desires. It came from the heart, from the soul, and from the quiet, unwavering will to endure. The younger generation began to embrace a different form of beauty. They no longer idolized the young and the beautiful. Instead, they sought the wisdom of the older generation, especially women like Abony. They wanted to learn the art of patience, of nurturing, of resilience in the face of adversity. And so, the village began to flourish in a new way. The elders passed down their wisdom not just through words, but through action, through their everyday lives, which were rich with the lessons of experience. Abony continued to live a life of quiet grace, never seeking the spotlight but always there when she was needed. Her days were spent helping others, counseling the troubled, and guiding the young women of the village as they navigated their own lives. She had found peace in her role, knowing that the legacy she left behind would be one of inner strength and wisdom, a legacy far more lasting than any fleeting beauty or fleeting love. Years passed and the village changed, but the lessons learned through Abony's life remained steadfast. People no longer judged each other based on superficial measures. Instead, they valued each other for their kindness, their wisdom, and their contributions to the greater good. Abony's teachings had become woven into the very fabric of village life, and even after her death, the people continued to honor her memory. The shrine by the sacred grove remained a place of pilgrimage for those who sought strength, wisdom, and peace. It became a symbol of the quiet, often unseen miracles that could transform not just a village, but the very hearts of its people. Abony had shown them that strength wasn't in the surface, it was in the quiet moments, the wisdom born of experience, and the ability to rise above life's trials. She had lived through betrayal, heartbreak, and humiliation, but she had emerged from it all with a heart that was stronger than any force that could have broken it. The village that had once been divided by vanity and youthful beauty was now a community bound by respect, wisdom, and the enduring strength of spirit. And so, the tale of Abony and Kola became a story not just of betrayal, but of redemption. It was a story of how a woman's quiet strength and wisdom could change a village forever. The village had transformed, and in doing so, it had created a legacy that would last for generations to come. Years passed, and the village that had once been divided, torn by the secrets of Kola's betrayal and Abony's quiet suffering, had transformed into a place of wisdom, respect, and unity. The younger generation, now flourishing under the new values that had taken root, had heard the stories of Abony, the woman who endured betrayal and heartbreak, yet remained a beacon of strength. Abony had become more than just a name. She was a symbol, a living legacy that transcended her own life and continued to inspire those who came after her. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting its golden light over the village, a young girl named Yijai walked into the sacred grove. She was a child of the new generation, one born after the transformation who had only heard the stories and seen the shrine that had been built in Abony's honor. Yijai had grown up with the teachings of Abony, but it wasn't until now that she had come to fully understand the depth of those teachings. Yijai had always been curious about the woman whose name was spoken with such reverence. Her grandmother had often told her stories of Abony's strength and wisdom, of how she had silently endured the pain of betrayal and walked through life with grace. But there was still something about Abony's story that Yijai longed to understand. She had heard the tales, but she wanted to know the heart of Abony's soul, the things that had made her who she was. With that, Yijai had made her way to the sacred grove, where the shrine stood as a testament to Abony's enduring legacy. The air was thick with the scent of earth and flowers, and the silence of the grove felt sacred, almost as if the very soil had absorbed the wisdom and strength that Abony had imparted to it. There at the base of the shrine, was an old, weathered journal, Abony's journal. The journal had been placed in the grove by the elders, as a way to ensure that Abony's words, her thoughts, and her reflections would be preserved for generations to come. With a quiet reverence, Yijai sat down beside the journal and carefully opened it. The pages, though yellowed with age, were filled with Abony's elegant handwriting, each word a reflection of the wisdom she had acquired through a lifetime of suffering, resilience, and quiet strength. As Yijai read through the pages, She felt as though she was connecting with the very spirit of the woman who had changed the course of the village's history. In the journal, Abony spoke of the pain she had endured, not just at the hands of her unfaithful husband, but also from the community that had failed to protect her. She spoke of the heartache she had felt when Kola had abandoned her for a younger woman, of the deep betrayal that had shaken her to her core. But more than that, Abony spoke of her healing process. She wrote about how she had found strength not in revenge, but in the quiet moments of reflection, in the tending of the sick and the care of the young girls. She wrote about how she had made peace with her suffering, how she had come to understand that some pain could not be punished, but it could be witnessed by the ancestors. And in that witness, justice would be found. Abony's words resonated deeply with Yijai, who had never known such pain herself, but could feel the weight of it through Abony's voice. As she read, Yijai felt her heart swell with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. She understood now why the village had changed, why the people had come to respect Abony not just for her endurance, but for her ability to rise above the cruelty that had been visited upon her. Abony had not sought revenge, nor had she lashed out in anger. Instead, she had chosen to live her life with grace, to continue serving others and nurturing her community. And through that, she had earned something far more powerful than revenge. She had earned the eternal respect of the ancestors and through them, the justice she had longed for. The final entry in the journal was brief, yet it left Yijai with a deep sense of understanding. Abony had written, "Some pain cannot be punished, but it can be witnessed by the ancestors and they never forget." Yijai closed the journal, her hands trembling with the weight of what she had just read. The final message was clear, but it was also profound. There was no need for vengeance when there was the witness of time, when there was the understanding that all actions, both good and bad, were seen by the ancestors, the spirits of the past who watched over the living. The ancestors, Abony believed, held the power to right the wrongs that had been committed, even if that righting came in ways unseen by the living. Yijai stood up slowly, feeling the quiet strength of Abony surrounding her. The village, she realized, had been changed not just by the events that had unfolded, but by the quiet wisdom of a woman who had chosen to live with dignity despite the trials she had faced. Abony had shown them that strength did not come from rage or from seeking revenge, but from the ability to endure, to witness, and to trust that the ancestors would hold the truth of every action. With one final glance at the shrine, Yijai walked out of the grove, feeling as though she had been forever changed by what she had learned. Abony's story was no longer just a story of a woman who had suffered. It was the story of resilience, of justice, and of the quiet power of wisdom. The villagers had learned that justice was not always immediate, nor was it always visible in the ways they expected. Sometimes, it took years, even generations, for the true nature of a person's actions to be revealed. As the years went by, the people of the village continued to honor Abony's memory. Her name became synonymous with wisdom, grace, and inner strength. Whenever there was a situation where justice was needed, whether it was a dispute between villagers or a matter of moral conflict, the people would invoke Abony's name. They would remember her words, her strength, and her ability to rise above the trials that life had thrown at her. And in those moments, Abony's spirit was felt, her wisdom guiding the hearts of the living, just as it had always done. The village, transformed by Abony's legacy, thrived in ways that could never have been imagined before. The focus shifted from outward beauty and youth to a deeper appreciation for the inner strength of the people. The lessons of patience, resilience, and wisdom passed down by Abony were woven into the fabric of village life, and as the generations passed, they carried her story forward. Abony had lived a life marked by pain, betrayal, and silence. But in the end, it was her quiet strength, her refusal to seek revenge, and her trust in the ancestors that transformed not just her own life, but the entire village. Her legacy became a beacon of hope, guiding the villagers to understand that some pain, though it cannot be punished, will always be witnessed, and in that witness, justice will be found. And as Yijai walked away from the sacred grove, she knew that the village would never forget Abony's name. It would be remembered whenever justice was needed, whenever wisdom was sought, and whenever strength was called for. Abony had taught them all that justice, in its purest form, does not always come immediately, but it will come, in time, through the ancestors' watchful eyes.